Welcome to the Building Up Women in Property podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Bangura, and I'm thrilled to have you join us today. Whether you're a woman aiming to become a confident, impactful leader, or you're a leader committed to promoting gender equity in the property and construction industry, this podcast is designed specifically for you. Join me every week to gain insights and inspiration that will leave you excited and confident about taking your next steps. Thank you for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's topic. From the broken rung to the glass ceiling, the systemic challenges keeping women stuck. Today, we are delving into the big issues. Now, this is a big topic, and these systemic challenges have been prevalent for a very long time. So today's episode is in two parts. In this episode, we are really going to delve into what the systemic challenges are and the impacts they have. And in the upcoming episode, we are going to talk about how we address them and how we move forward as individuals and as a collective to create meaningful, lasting change. I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you today, not because it's particularly pleasant, but because it's the conversations that we need to be having. I recently read Tiago Forte's book called Building a Second Brain, and it's a great book if you're a nerd like me and you're always seeking sort of productivity hacks and how to accomplish more. But one of the things in his book was around having your 12 favorite problems. And this is an idea that comes from the physicist Richard Feynman, who advised to sort of keep this list of about a dozen things or problems that are in the back of your mind and that you're constantly working on and contributing new ideas to. And when I sat down and thought about my 12 problems, it's probably no surprise that at the top of that list for me was, how do we create gender equality? And this question really is something that runs in the back of my mind. And obviously it guides the work I do with my individual private clients and also with organizations as well. And for a long time, I've really grappled with this idea of how much can we empower the individual to create change and how much relies on the system itself. The reality is we need both. We need women to stop waiting for permission and stop being the nice girl on challenges and issues within the industry. So I think there's a huge piece around personal empowerment and advocacy. And, you know, I see day in, day out the results that my clients get when they step up and into that space for themselves. But we also need the organisations that we work for, the society that we exist in, to change. And we need to challenge the stereotypes that exist in order to create a space where men and women and non-binary people and people of all different types of diverse backgrounds and orientations all have the same access to good pay and good working conditions and to all the freedoms that come with that. And so today I want to talk about what the systemic challenges actually are. What are the things that we need to tackle, not only as individuals, but also at that organisation and societal level to ensure that we have gender equity moving forward. So let's dive into it. What is a systemic issue? A systemic issue really refers to the problems or the issues that are embedded within the structures of our organisations and our society. So these are not one-time or individual issues. They are problems that are really built into the systems that govern our everyday lives. And they show up in our workplaces, they show up in our governments and our politics and our legal systems and also our homes. And this is so important to recognise because often we see women in situations thinking that they are an isolated case or this is just happening to them. And that is not the case. These are issues that are reoccurring and they are pervasive. And often it is really just helpful to recognise that this is not about me. It is not a personal thing. It is something bigger than me and bigger than this moment. And as we talk today, and through this episode today, you're going to hear me using some different terms and concepts. And there are a lot of concepts that we can talk about when we talk about the barriers that women face in male-dominated spaces and perhaps the world in general. And it can at times feel a bit jargony, but it's so important that we do name and understand these concepts because firstly, it helps us clarify what are often quite complex issues. And it also allows us to really have targeted conversations about the challenges and the solutions while highlighting the systemic nature of these issues. And in doing that, it really does empower us and it allows us to advocate and drive for policy change and societal change. But coming back to this idea of systemic challenges and systemic issues, these really are, as I said, rooted within our culture and within our institutions. And they often stem from long-standing beliefs that we have, or norms or stereotypes and practices, which have historically placed men and women unequally. And, an example of this is the belief that men are more suitable for leadership roles. Up until quite recently, that was a really well-established and widely held belief. And the result, of course, is that led to fewer women in leadership positions. And if we have fewer women in leadership roles, then young women have fewer role models, which then reduces the ambition for those young women because they just don't think it's possible for them. So these systemic issues become self-reinforcing. And the only way we can really address these issues and create long-term meaningful change is to change the policies, to change the practices and rewrite the cultural norms that surround women's roles, their abilities and their rights. I think the best analogy I can use for this is if you think of a garden and it's full of weeds, right? If we think about these systemic issues as being the weeds, we can come through with a lawnmower and we can mow the weeds out and not see that they are there, but the roots are still embedded in the soil. And until we actually pull those weeds out by the roots, we are just band-aiding. We are just dealing with things on an individual level. We're not tackling the broader underlying factors and issues that cause the unequal opportunities for men and women. And so it is really critical that we address these systemic issues in order to achieve gender equality and empower women to be represented right throughout the property and construction industry in all types of roles. And so these systemic issues really boil down to a number of different things. So one is gender bias and stereotyping. So gender bias refers to the preference or prejudice towards one gender over the other. Gender stereotyping is the preconceived notions about the roles and behaviours that are appropriate for women and for men. And they are based on traditional gender roles and societal expectations rather than the individual's abilities and the individual's preference. And both of these things really impact hiring decisions. They impact promotions as well as day-to-day interactions in the workplace. And again, an example can be around the construction industry has been perceived as being this really sort of tough culture that requires sort of physical strength. And when a hiring manager has that view, that can prevent qualified women from even entering into the field or advancing into higher level positions or leadership, which ultimately limits the diversity of the workforce and the appeal of the industry to women. And another example of this is around maternity and family bias. So, one of these concepts is often called the maternal wall, which refers to the discrimination that women may encounter when they either become mothers or are perceived as potentially becoming mothers. And it's this idea that, women will always put their families first and that will become their priority, which then makes them less committed to their careers and less competent. And that really does affect women's opportunities for promotion and it challenges their professional credibility. And it often results in women being forced to choose between family and careers, which then exacerbates the gender gap that we have in senior roles. Now, another big challenge with systemic issues is around the lack of representation. So as I mentioned before, the fact that we don't have women represented at all levels within our organisation and within our society, and particularly lacking at that senior and executive level, that lack of visibility not only affects the perceptions about women's capabilities, but it also impacts that younger generation of women's aspirations and their potential to see themselves in those types of roles. And when we look specifically at the construction industry, for the 2022-23 year, we had 6% of CEO roles filled by women. We had 20% of executive leadership teams made up by women and only 16% of boards made up with women. So we see a huge underrepresentation of women within the construction industry. And then when we look at property and real estate, the numbers aren't vastly different. We have 11% of CEOs being women, 32% of executive leadership team, and 28% of boards being women. We drill down further and we see only 2% of all tradespeople being women. And even at a national level, across industries, we only have 22% of CEOs in Australia being women. And that's why it's so important that we see women stepping into leadership roles. And of course, the added benefit is the significant improvements we see to performance, to innovation that comes from having diversity. Okay, other systemic issues we face are, workplace culture and harassment. And typically construction has been an unwelcoming and at times hostile place for women to be. And that can be seen from overt sexual harassment right through to subtle forms of discrimination, such as, exclusion from that informal network that might exist, or women being spoken over in meetings. And it can be seen in the graffiti that we see on hoarding and job sites that is derogatory and unwelcoming. And we see it in terms of access to amenities for women on job sites. We also then have wage inequality. And of course, there is in that two parts, which is around equal pay. So equal pay for equal work. So men and women receiving the same remuneration for doing the same role. And whilst that is absolutely legislated and has been for a long time, there is still a gap. But then the other issue is around gender pay equity. And this is about how do we get women into higher paying jobs. We see men occupying the higher paying roles within the industry, and we see women continuing to occupy administrative and support functions that are typically lower paid. And this all then ties into the career progression barriers that women face. And to name a few of these, we see things like the broken rung. So this refers to the initial promotion within a role. And for women, it is often really, really difficult to take that first step into a management role compared to their male counterparts. And this is often the first barrier, particularly for women who work on the corporate side of things. This is the first barrier that prevents them from entering that leadership pipeline. And of course, the impacts of that are huge. So without that first crucial promotion, women's careers often stagnate, right? Because they immediately perceive themselves and are perceived by others as being lesser than their male counterparts. And that impact compounds over time, right? And it really does affect women's career trajectories. It affects their salaries and their retirement savings. And it is a huge contributor to the leaky pipeline where we talk about women leaving the industry because they can't see themselves getting ahead, and they see that discrepancy between them and their male colleagues growing further and further apart. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we see the glass ceiling. So the glass ceiling is this metaphor of that invisible barrier that prevents women from reaching senior leadership or executive roles, despite having the qualifications and the achievements. So this is kind of that top end of the ceiling. And it influences organisations' culture and policies by not having women represented in those senior leadership positions. And if we think of this as a continuum of barriers, starting from the broken rung, going up to the glass ceiling, and even the concrete ceiling, which refers to women of colour who have an even harder time breaking through into leadership roles and senior leadership positions, we can see that the process is fraught with issues, and we need to, as individuals and as a collective, be able to address these challenges that affect not only early career stages, but also advanced career stages, and the way forward to addressing these issues. And there are many ways that we can move forward to address these issues and to create this systemic change that we are all seeking. And this is obviously a huge topic, and we're going to come back next week and talk about how do we move forward? How do we actually break down these barriers so that people can progress, so that we can really see that meaningful, systemic, long-term change in our industry? How do we create a space where women are valued and have influence in the same way that men are? So we'll delve into this in the next episode. But I want you, having heard about these systemic barriers, I want you to think about how they show up for you or have shown up for you in your work. Whether you're a woman listening to this who has experienced these particular issues, or whether you're a male ally who wants to create change in the industry, then I want you to think about how you see these issues playing out in the culture of your organisation and on your projects. And give yourself some time to think about this. And that will really help you take away some clear actions from next episode. I look forward to coming back to this with you next week. Thank you for being here. And if you found today's episode useful, I would love if you could take a moment and rate and review the podcast. It helps other people in the industry find it. And also share this episode with a colleague or a friend who you think would benefit from it, because we need to work together to create the change in the industry. Okay, my friend, until next episode. Thank you for joining me on the Building Up Women in Property podcast. I'm Rebecca Bangura, and if you'd like to learn more about what I do, head over to LinkedIn and connect with me. Have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time.